Hello, everyone, and welcome to one more episode of MetaCast, the podcast of the Meta-Analysis Academy. I'm honored to welcome to the stage today Andrew or Ande Bagdasarian, Ph.D. He's going to talk to us all about a Ph.D. career, and postgraduate, postdoc career as well. We've had many guests here who are not typically don't follow the traditional path of clinical care as physicians, residency, fellowship. We've had recently, for example, Daniel, who is in biotechnology. So it's always good. I'm really excited to share Ande's story here with you guys today. He's going to talk to us about, the pathway and his own journey. And of course, a lot of that will relate to inspire you, who's interested, of course, in a research career in the United States. So Ande, thank you so much for joining here. Really excited to hear your story and share with our group.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's a great honor to be on the program.
Yeah, absolutely. So before I get started and turn it over to Ande with some questions, he's going to tell us about his background and everything else. Just a quick reminder that what we discuss here today is not affiliated with the institutions where we work. The opinions are our own and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of our employers. Also, if you guys want to learn how to do research with autonomy and publish impactful papers, don't forget to join the Meta-Analysis Academy waitlist. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let's get right to it. Ande, tell us a little about your background, your family background. Where are you from, and where'd you grow up? And then what ultimately, when you finished high school, you decided to go to college. What field did you decide to pursue?
Right, that's a great question. I was born in Western New York, but was raised in Florida. I'm first generation American. My father, he's Armenian, and the whole family's actually from Iran. A lot of them still live there. And he came over in the 70s, met my mom, and that's how I'm here today.
Nice.
But yeah, when I was just a kid, we moved to Florida. I grew up there. And as I was going through school, I was interested in a lot of things, but I was pretty decent at science, pretty decent at math. And once I got into school at Florida State University, I actually initially wanted to go into potentially film school or even maybe a writing program, but that didn't pan out. And I thought, okay, well, science is something that I like, something that I'm good at. And I started to get focused on chemical engineering with a subspecialty in biomedical engineering. Part of that for me was, engineering is a good mix of your basic sciences of chemistry, physics, mathematics, and then the biomedical side of things really interested me because at that time there were so many recently new developments in things like stem cell technology, nanotechnology, drug delivery, and it was just a really cool new growing field. And so that's how I ended up getting that subspecialty in biomedical engineering in my major. And, at that time, I wasn't totally sure what I wanted to do, if I wanted to go straight from my degree to, the workforce or go to academia. And one of the things that I started to do was kind of window shop around my department. At any graduate program that you're in, you can just go to any of the researchers, any of the professors, ask them about their research, see what they're doing, and see if it interests you. And, more often than not, they're very happy to take you on as, a volunteer or just someone to come in over summer, do a little bit of data analysis, get some experience, see if you like it. And that can really inform your decision if you want to, go forward with academia or do something else.
So before we go into the chemical and engineering and all of that in your career, you went to FSU, right? Mm-hmm. So Florida State University. A lot of you guys are foreigners, like both of us. I mean, Ande grew up over here. His parents are immigrants. As you guys know, I'm from Brazil, but when I lived in Florida too, and I was 10, and then just a quick funny story here. When we moved to Tampa, and when we moved there, people from church, they were really welcoming. They gave us, some, furniture, all these things. And one of the things that I got was a football, and it was a football with the Seminoles like logo on it. And I became an FSU fan, at age 10, So up until this day, I never went to FSU, but because of that, I cheered them on. It's too bad they haven't done really well in recent years.
At least they won the championship while I was there.
Yeah, true. You should cheer them on. So you did chemical engineering then at FSU, and then you went, just to keep going on your story. And again, we're going to talk about PhD. I think it'll be really helpful for you guys. A lot of you guys are med students and doctors from all over the world. I want to get into in a little bit about specific, the research track, doing a PhD program, options in industry and academia, types of funding from industry, from the NIH. It's going to be super helpful to you guys. But Andy, when you decided to shop around for these opportunities after finishing graduate school, what did you ultimately decide to do?
After finishing graduate school or my undergraduate?
Undergraduate, excuse me.
So I ultimately decided to start applying and looking into graduate programs. My main focus was my home institute, FSU, because I knew the possibilities that were there. I knew that there were open slots. I had talked to some of the faculty who had ongoing projects and ongoing funding from the NIH or NSF. And in that process, I still looked around at other schools. I think when it comes to the process of figuring out what's good for you, you can keep doing that window shopping with other programs, around the country. You can really easily find and contact people in departments who have, research projects that are related to your interests. And more often than not, they're very happy to sit down with you on a video call and explain what they're doing. Even if they don't have a position available, usually they're very happy to talk to you, because I think nowadays not as many people are as inclined to go into academia. And so it's a very good connection to have with people to try and say, this is the kind of work that we want to do. Even if it doesn't work out with you coming to my lab, maybe they can refer you to somebody or point you in a direction, something like that.
It's a way to advertise.
Yeah, exactly.
Good. So after you talked to these people, what was your next step in your career?
After talking to them, I sent out my applications, and essentially once I got into my home institute, I decided to go there. And from there, I had pretty formal meetings with the faculty that had available positions. And at that point, I currently work as a translational neuroimaging scientist. And at that point, once I was in my first year of grad school, I wasn't really too sure exactly what I wanted to do. During undergrad, I had volunteered in a stem cell lab. I worked in a biopolymer lab for maybe a few months as well, just to get some exposure. But ultimately, when I met with my PI that I had, my advisor during my graduate studies, he was focused on ultra-high field MRI methods to look at ischemic stroke, to look at migraine, and also working with the stem cell lab that I actually volunteered in as a sort of therapeutic application towards ischemic stroke. And I thought, I was already interested in that. That already seems like a pretty good fit. And, when it comes to something like ischemic stroke, I have a little bit of family history with that disease. And so at the time, it just felt kind of serendipitous, like a really good fit. And so I sat down with my advisor. He said he had, positions available, and we kind of went from there, sort of carved out niches within what his project was focused on, what I can, go and pursue, in combination with what he wants to do, but also find something that interests me along that line.
Nice. Let's skip ahead and just talk a little bit about what you do. You mentioned neuroimaging there. Mm-hmm. What's your day-to-day activity in research right now? What's the current stage where you are in your career?
Right. So now I'm a fourth-year postdoc. And for my day-to-day, it really varies depending on whatever project is at hand. We have a few collaborators who are kind of in novel drug development, looking for, radioligands to apply to PET imaging for neurodegenerative disorders. I've been involved in projects looking at how different drugs, when you apply them to either an animal or a human model, how they change biomarkers in the brain. And so day to day, it can be, performing the experiments. I'm often doing a lot of data analysis, a lot more writing now, especially as I get towards the end phase of my postdoc, either for, manuscripts or review papers or grant writing. As time goes on, grant writing does take up what seems like the majority of your time.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that, because you got to have the money from somewhere to do the research.
Exactly. It always comes down to that at the end of the day.
So at this point in your career, you've done undergraduate school, and then you did graduate school, and then PhD, and then a postdoctorate now, fourth year postdoc.
Exactly.
Right. Very good. So it's quite a long journey. A lot of our audience will relate. Like I did, we didn't do undergraduate in Brazil, but medical school 6 years, and then residency. I did 9 years of residency, which would be equivalent to a postdoctoral degree, but in clinical training, not in research. Mm-hmm. And along the way, at least for us as physicians, there's always incentive not to train more and do more, fellowships and this and that. and go and get a job. Like we could do something as short as a 3-year residency program and go work, become what's called a hospitalist, an internal medicine doctor. Is it the same in a research career like yours, where you did graduate school, but then PhD and then a postdoc? Along the way, did you have opportunities or people trying to recruit you or situations where you could apply to, forget, studying more and doing all this stuff? Can I just go and get a job and get paid a higher salary? Did you have those opportunities?
I would say so, yeah, because especially within translational medicine, there's tons of companies that want to implement, say, a new analytical pipeline or maybe a new drug. Maybe some pharma company is developing some tool that they want to implement for a disease or a psychiatric disorder. And that's where we can come in to look at in vivo biomarkers applied to that. And it can be really helpful for them, downstream as they're, building their pipelines and doing their drug development. And then that also gives us that connection to them for either future collaboration or potentially, if something might open up with them in the future, they may want you to join them in some capacity.
Yeah. Yeah, and what's the incentive to stay and keep doing more? Like in
academia.
Yeah, well, in academia, because as a medical doctor, it's because you get to train in a new area. Like, I'm going to do cardiology now, and I'm going to do electrophysiology. And you sort of like delay going into the job market and trade for more and more training, which may ultimately even increase your market value. Is that sort of the same thing?
When it comes to academia and what makes me comfortable there is you really get to guide what you're doing. You're kind of setting down what projects you want to work on, what interests you. You're not really at the behest of some entity, some like upper management saying we're going to work on this now. If it doesn't work out, we're on to the next thing, which can be how industry works sometimes. And some people are fine with that.
Yeah.
But when it comes to what I want to do, I really like the idea of, being my own project manager, making the effort and kind of, the fight or the case to be able to do my research.
That's very cool. You mentioned that. But I got to say, and I'm going to pick your brain on this, which is, and again, I'm bringing the parallel and from what I know from doing research as an MD. But for us, you do have more autonomy in academia if you're running a lab, but on the other hand, you also have to get the money.
Exactly.
So
it's a struggle.
It's a struggle. Like I was talking yesterday, we had a dinner with we have a computed tomography, cardiac computed tomography research group at Brigham where I work, and we had a dinner, and one of the researchers there, a really great guy, he's like, hey, it's the grants and the NIH and this and that. And I see that struggle in people who are doing a research-oriented career as an MD. It's like they're always fighting for the next grant.
I will say, as I was in grad school and even as a postdoc, that doesn't stop. Let's say you get an R1, it's always okay. Let's still plan for the.
A lot of
you
people
get an
don't
R1,
know.
you're set.
R1 is one of the best grants that there is.
It's 4 to 5 years of
protected time
and funding, and you can run a lab, you can hire people, but it's still you have that time limit, and you always got to be thinking ahead. What's the next thing? Or do I want to start a new project that is slightly related to this, but we can start a different type of grant process for it.
Yeah.
And it's kind of a hustle. You really got to work hard for it, and some people enjoy it, some people don't. I tend to like the writing process because that gives me an opportunity to be kind of creative. When you have an idea for a project and then you start setting out for writing a grant or a review paper on it, you're really hashing out how am I going to do this relative to my research goals? How am I going to make it translational to the clinic? Which is the ultimate goal. That's the only reason anybody's going to want to give you money for a grant, right? Is to have it be applicable to somebody who's going to need it in a medical context.
Right. When I finished residency, like I said, 9 years of residency and fellowship, I had that option. I elected, to be quite honest, to do a more clinically oriented career, because then it seems way more predictable for me as a clinician. I'm gonna see one full day of clinic. I'm going to read echoes, read CTs, read MRIs, and I'm going to get paid at the end of the month, and that's going to be it, But I know people who do well in research and get really good at getting those grants. They do extremely well.
Yeah, and I do appreciate the variability. Granted, it can be very uncertain at times, and that can be a little frustrating, sometimes a little worrying. But I like that it's not, for me, I like that it's not static. There new things come along, new avenues open up, new people and collaborators reach out. And I think that's a really cool aspect of it.
Nice. We started talking about the grant, R01 grant. Walk us through the avenues of funding that a research lab like yours and others can have here in the U.S. So one big category is industry, right? So like for us, I'm a principal investigator now in a study funded by Novartis, and then they'll come and they'll inject money and we'll do a research project that's aligned with their interests. But then there's this huge category of NIH grants. Can you tell us a little bit, about the different types of grants, the main ones, the grants that you've been involved with previously, for example?
Yeah, so right about the first year that I started my postdoc, I actually got what's called a T32 training grant. And that is essentially your institute or someone in your institute will get a grant from the NIH to then run their own training program within the institute. And so they'll open up slots and they'll find prospective postdocs to pay for their salary, a little bit of their research, things for conferences, journal submissions, things like that. Usually under a certain specific, scope or goal under that T32. In my case, it was multimodal imaging applied to neurodegenerative disorders, specifically Alzheimer's.
So it's a training grant. It's money to train new researchers, essentially.
Exactly. And it's usually you'll have a PI or a team of PIs who will apply to establish that program within the institute, and that'll run for X number of years. They'll have X number of slots, and then that will give you, let's say, 1 to 3 years of training. And under the scope of a T32, I believe you have to be an American citizen or a green card holder.
You do.
But they have what's called like a payback agreement where, let's say you get a year of funding, you technically have to pay back that first year of funding.
Really?
But the way that it works is that as you are, working in science, that is a form of your payback.
Oh, okay.
As you're continuing, your academic career or research career, that is within the scope of the payback agreement.
That T32 grant is very common in the medical field. So like I mentioned, at the Brigham, we have an imaging lab. There are several T32 fellows. These are, for our audience who are MDs, these are people typically who finished at least residency generally, sometimes even residency and cardiology fellowship, for example. And now they do a T32. The grant is not theirs specifically, it's the institutions, as Ande said. And then they'll be selected. There's a selection process, and then they'll be part of this grant where the NIH funding through the institution, the T32 will pay their salary and conferences and research initiatives. So T32, that's one very common category to introduce people into the way of research.
Exactly. And then for, let's say, advancing your career, there's other training grants, which are usually called the K-series grants. And I think the one that's most applicable for the audience that tends to be a little more international, there's one called the K99, which is open to U.S. citizens, international people. And what it usually is sort of a 3-year portion that's focused primarily on your training. You're doing research as well, but you're getting a heavy amount of training. And then the next 2 years are what's called the ROO phase, which is essentially your period at which you're going to transition into independence. And part of that entails wrapping up your research and then applying for higher funding like an R21 or an R01, which will then, set the stage for you to have kind of like an independent lab and start, maybe hiring your own students or your own postdocs and, really setting the ground for your own true independence as a researcher.
Nice. So there are different types of K grants, right? You mentioned the K99 available to international MDs, PhDs as well. And then, but even within the K category, there's different types of K grants, right?
There are, yeah. For my field, or for my specialty, actually, I have been applying for K01s. Those are exclusive to citizens and green card holders. But there's a few other ones that are more focused on clinicians, I believe, and physicians.
Yeah.
A lot more clinical applications and subdivisions within the K tier.
And then what about this R01? Like, tell us a little bit more about that. Yeah.
So at least at Mass General, usually how it works is you have to be a full-time faculty to be able to apply for those. So postdocs, unfortunately, right now can't apply for those. But they can help your PI secure enough funding to, help you in your career move on to the next stage. If there's enough funding to go around and you have been a productive postdoc for enough period of time, they can, try to help raise you to the next level to become that full-time faculty. If the conditions are appropriate and good. But there's different types of Rs that you can apply for. There's R03, which is, I want to say 1 to 2 year level grant. It's a small amount of money, but usually looking at, retrospective data analysis or trying to, do some sort of analysis to then boost a future application, either an R21 or an R01. I mentioned R21, that's usually a 2-year grant to do, a more short-term kind of quick study that then, again, can be used to support a future application, hopefully for an R01.
Nice. So that's the idea is that you start maybe in a training grant, or you get these early type grants, early career grants, K grants, and then you ultimately become an independent researcher, have your own lab, and
that's the goal. Yeah.
Go into like the R grants.
Exactly. And I would stress that the key thing about the K grants, that they are really career development grants. You can have the greatest project in the world laid out for your research strategy and specific aims, but it's equally as important to have a really good training program, whether that's, your mentorship committee from a diverse group of fields. You don't want everybody to be having the same specialty, because then how are you going to learn anything new? That could be courses at whatever institutions that you're affiliated with. Here you could possibly, apply to go to courses at MIT or Harvard to, help boost your own knowledge in, say, drug pharmacology or signal processing, whatever.
They're looking for that component of career development when you apply for the grant.
Yeah, and you really need to stress, how do you need training? How do you need this sort of grant to further your career?
I've multiple of the people around me have applied to these grants over the past years. I've had faculty members who've applied for R01s, and early career junior doctors applying for K grants and all that. And something that is striking to me is that they invest a lot of time preparing these grants. And I know this is very variable. Different people will do it at different rates, and also depends on the project experience and all that. But on average, how long do you say it would take someone to write an early career or career development grant, like a K family type of grant? How long would it take, in months or weeks, to write something like that?
That's a great question. I would not do weeks, but I would say try to have your idea, like the seed, planted, let's say, at least 6 months before your institutional due dates. That'll give you plenty of time to really lay out your specific aims. What questions are you trying to address? How is it going to be beneficial long term for the clinic? And is what you're going to be doing truly novel? That's another big part of it. And then you also have enough time to set out your mentorship kind of committee. And, they're not only just going to be training you, they're also going to be helping you, develop this project and even apply methods that you're not going to be an expert in.
You have to put your team together.
Exactly. Yeah. And you will be leading it, but you're going to have the resources available to you by having that committee available at your disposal.
Nice. After those 6 months that from idea until institutional deadline, you get feedback, I'm sure, and eventually you're going to apply. How long does it typically take for the NIH or other funding agency to review these?
I would say the last submission that I did was in November, and I believe I heard back if it was going to be reviewed in February, and then they had the review date a few months after that. Right now, because things have been shifting a little bit with the new administration, things got delayed a little bit, and I'm sure there's working out kinks and trying to figure out exactly how they're going to be doing things in the near future.
But it sounds like about 6 months.
It can take a while. Yeah.
are you funded currently by any of these grants or your lab?
My PI currently has a not an R01, but I actually forget the specific type of grant that it is, but enough to fund the lab at present.
And I just want to give people a sense of how these works. Like once the project is funded, I'm sure there are regulatory requirements they give you the money, and then they want to make sure that you're using the money correctly and that things are going accordingly and all that, right?
We did actually just have an R21 get accepted, and when you're doing, let's say, more clinical minded research, you have human subjects that are coming in. You have to show that you're reaching certain milestones in terms of recruitment, let's say, or successful experiments. We do a lot of PET and MRI on these people, and we have to show, hey, we have done these experiments. Recruitment can only get you so far if the people don't actually, come in and do the actual experiments for you or with you. And there are those types of milestones that you have to lay out in terms of like a timetable or a schedule, which is good just, in general for your own kind of housekeeping.
Organization,
yeah.
For sure. Still under this financial piece, a lot of people are much junior in their career to what we're talking about. They're not applying for grants yet. They're international MDs or other healthcare areas, thinking about even applying for a PhD in the US. And you did a PhD here. How long was your PhD program? And then, did you get any funding during it? Did you get paid to do the PhD, or did you have to pay something to the university? How does a PhD program in the United States work?
So for my PhD was 5 years, and at least in my experience, you never have to pay for a PhD. That'll either come, from funding from your advisor, or let's say the department will support you. And what that might entail is they'll, cover the tuition, because in the US, you typically have to take courses, at least within the first couple of years of your PhD. And then if your PI, say, doesn't have enough money to fund you, you might have to do being a TA, for example, a teaching assistant.
Teaching assistant, yeah.
Exactly. And that can involve, making homework assignments, grading homework assignments, helping them, manage classes, things like that, which can be a little distracting when you're trying to just get your research done, but it's all a part of the process. But yeah, I got a stipend. I lived in Tallahassee, Florida, which is relatively low cost of living compared to Boston. But at the time, I was getting about $28,000 a year, and I would say, that was enough for there at that time to get by and live fine. But it is one thing to consider. Are you going to need roommates? Are you going to have to plan accordingly?
Yeah, it's not very much.
Yeah.
I'm sure it's a little higher now. Cost of living has gone up in the last few years in the US. But the sense I'm getting, it's kind of like residency, where you can barely make it. You have to be on a budget during those years. But on the other hand, it's you do get some money to focus on your career, on research and getting your degree, your PhD. So there's the positive side of it.
And it's temporary. When it comes to these programs, I'm sure residency was similar, but there's light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah.
You're going to get through it.
It's just very far, the light.
It's very far, yeah. But it really comes down to how you manage your own graduate experience. I think there's a lot of good habits to have, being able to set your own schedule and stick firm to it, making sure that you have time for your research, but also time for yourself. You don't want it to consume your whole life.
I'm guilty of that. And so what was the application process for a PhD like? And because international students may consider applying.
It varies by institute. There's a standardized test called the GRE that, at least when I was applying, was pretty common. I know some institutes have been moving away from that and removing that requirement. But there's, a formal application process. You pay a small fee ranging, I think, between $30 to $50, depending on the school. And then if they're interested, they'll sometimes invite you to a graduate weekend, come out, visit the facilities, visit the whole department, meet with people who are prospective advisors for you. And I would say you want to make the connections with prospective PIs before you apply, just so that you're not wasting your own time or money, and that there's something there for you. Because it is true that there are a lot of PhD positions available, but you don't want to be in a position where you just go to a school because it accepts you, and then you find out they have nothing that you really like there. Like if you want to do cardiology, you would want to look at prospective programs that are focused on that. Or if you want to do imaging related to that, you would look at programs related to that.
That makes sense. You really want to make sure that it's going to be worth your time, because it's like 4 to 5 years, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
I would also say, though, it's not a done deal within your first 1 or 2 years of your PhD. Let's say your interests shift and you want to go to a different lab or a different research project. That is totally fine.
Really?
It's not a one size fits all, and you might have, something that pops up in a different lab that really gets your interest and really grabs a hold of you. It is perfectly fine, to have that discussion with your current advisor and maybe make a switch.
What about career options? We were talking earlier about funding, where you... Oh, I actually remember one thing about funding. So we talked about industry, we talked about NIH or government agencies, and then at least in medicine, there's a third avenue of funding that I forgot to mention, which is like academic societies. So like American Heart Association, American College of Cardiology, ACR, American College of Radiology, like those massive academic institutions, societies of doctors may also offer funding. I'm not sure if, in your area, like if there's...
I actually applied to an AHA fellowship at one point during my graduate career because I was doing stroke research at the time. Usually those applications, I would say, are a little bit shorter than the government-funded ones, a lot more condensed on the research strategy that you have to flesh out.
Probably less money, too.
A little bit less money, yeah. But, hey, you gotta try for anything you can get your hands on.
Yeah.
But that is one thing to just be cognizant of, is just the sheer number of organizations that might have something for you.
Yeah.
It doesn't hurt to look.
Yeah, you have to, like anything in life, you have to be proactive.
Yeah.
You have to search these opportunities.
And I think that's one thing that people, miss because they just don't realize. There is a ton of organizations out there, even if it's just tangentially related to what you're doing.
Right.
If it can have that connection, the results of whatever project that you're proposing to do might have a great benefit, maybe not tomorrow, but years down the road for that organization and what their, research endeavors are.
Yeah. And as I was going to ask you earlier, during your journey as a PhD and now postdoc, what are the opportunities that come at the end of your training? Like, one would be certainly this traditional academic one that we talked about, where now you start applying for your own grants and early career development, and then R01s, and become your own lab and independent researcher. What else? I guess people could always go to industry. Is that right? Or how about education, going to universities and teach courses? Like, what are the options for someone who has this PhD, postdoc, oriented career?
Yeah, that sums it up pretty well, actually. You have the more academically research-minded people who want to go and do research full-time. Some people are truly passionate about the teaching aspect of it, and they'll just want to be full-time faculty doing that. And I think now in the U.S., there's a big push to have that as its own separate thing away from research as well. At my home institute at FSU, I recall them hiring a lot of faculty mainly for the teaching side of things, and also having separate faculty that were doing their own research. And I think it makes things potentially a little bit easier for the researchers so they can work on that full time. And then you also have dedicated people for, the teaching.
Nice.
But there's also, like you said, government agencies. There may be, regulatory bodies that may have a use for your expertise. Related to industry, there's also, patent offices. If you have, an expertise in drug pharmacology, that would be of high interest for them if they want to, try to develop patents on new technologies that they're developing. So it's a wide variety of things that are open to you, and it doesn't have to be the specific thing that you researched. If you have these skills in coding, data analytics, life sciences, you can go into a ton of different fields.
That's something so unique about the career in the U.S. because I did medical school in Brazil, and our culture there is one of you become a clinician, and then you do you become a doctor, you do residency, you do fellowship, and then you go work. You become a doctor, and you go see patients, and you're either a surgeon or a cardiologist, and you see patients in the office and all that. And the U.S. is like all these different opportunities. You could be a full-time clinician and educator. You could be a research oriented MD, and then in research you could work for industry. You could stay in academia. You could apply for NIH grants. So like there's so many options.
I think years ago it used to be similar in that if you were getting a PhD, it was just a foregone conclusion you're going to be a professor for the rest of your life. But as I was going through my program, so many people were open to going to industry, staying in academia, just doing teaching, and there was no qualms about that. There was no pushback from advisors or the department. It was just, if you have an opportunity that you see that you think would be, good for you, by all means, go for it.
Yeah. Well, one final question I have for you is, you mentioned the current administration, and we've all seen in the news about, it's a little bit tougher to get the grants, and the NIH is not funding, and now there's this dispute with Harvard and the federal government. Has that affected you, or the people doing research around you, or what's the environment like right now for research funding?
I think overall people are feeling extremely uncertain about the future. I think there's the whole thing going on with Harvard right now, which, it's just wild to see it happening, targeting like some of the most advanced research facilities that the country has to offer, that the world has to offer. In addition to that, you have, certain proposed bills, massive cuts to NIH grant-related funding, something like 44%, I think, is in the current iteration of that. And so that is one thing to keep in mind for pursuing these types of, positions. And, myself and all of the people I know, we try to be half glass full. Hopefully in the future things cool down, things get back to how they were in terms of, levels of funding, but also just the temperature in terms of the relation between the government and these institutions. Yeah. But I will say, we're very aware of the acute threat to academic research, and trying to navigate that is an ongoing process and very tricky.
Yeah, it's certainly unfortunate, and everyone, I think, would like to see an expedited solution to this. And like you said, seeing the half glass full, I get this question a lot in terms of immigration, which is kind of like the same thing. The current administration sort of like has had a tighter grip on access for foreign, even scholars, and residents, and people who are in research and medicine. But what I like to reassure people is that the U.S. has lived in like more than 200 years of a shift, between Republican and Democrat, and pro-immigration and less against and more anti-immigration, and there's this shift, so I would encourage people to just keep, doing what they're passionate about.
Keep going.
It may be a little tough now.
Don't give up in the face of something like this.
It's not to minimize the struggles that people are facing right now, obviously, but just keep pushing on.
It's all that you can do, and I mean, it's a daily fight when you're doing something like that.
And then I also like to remind people, as hard as it is right now, like the U.S. is still, like, at least compared to the places that I know, still, one of the most welcoming places for people who are scientists, for people who do good research, who have good ideas, who write well, who
anyone from all over the world.
From all over the world.
International researchers and students are kind of the bedrock of American academia.
Exactly.
Yeah,
and we all hope and pray that it's going to stay that way. Andy, actually, I did remember one other question that I wanted to ask you. You've been mentored by many. I'm sure you've mentored a lot of people in your own career now that you're at the stage of postdoc. What are some key things you look as a mentee when you're working with someone, with a mentor, or look for? And what are some of the things that you try to apply as a mentor to others, that you think are super helpful to them? What are the key elements you see in a mentor-mentee relationship?
I think someone who's willing to, guide you in your path, but not hold your hand the entire way. It can be a bit scary at times, but getting that independence as time goes on, I think, is really critical to developing yourself as a scientist, even if it seems scary at first. But I think someone who is present, someone who is available to hear your concerns, to hear your ideas, because that's how you actually develop, hypotheses and write your papers and all of those sorts of things that are critical to your own development and education. And I think as someone who hopes to be a mentor to people in this field, I hope to do that same thing, really show them, like, I'm listening to you. I want to hear your ideas. I want you to think critically, and I want you to ask questions. I don't want you to just hear what I have to say. I want to hear what you have to say, because when it comes to, advancing these things, diverse ideas, diverse opinions, people coming from all over the world, that's how you come up with really cool new ideas.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. Well, Andy, it's been great to have you here on MetaCast. You bring such a unique and diverse experience here to our audience. Congratulations on your beautiful career so far, and I'm sure you're going to do great things in research and neuroimaging, so it's really great to have you on.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Nice. So one final word of advice or recommendation for people who are inspired by your story, who want to follow in your footsteps, who want to have a research career and apply for grants and do a PhD and a postdoctoral fellowship. Like, what do you advise them on inspiring them for this journey?
Stay curious, stay persistent, stay humble, just keep doing what you're doing. It's not a big splash, it's the little ripples in your career, If you feel like you're not making a contribution, I promise you that you are. It just takes time for that to realize.
Yeah, I like this advice. I really do. It's the little things we do every day that over, years, honestly, that really build up to a really giant step in one's career, Like you're here in MGH and Harvard, doing your postdoc fellowship, but
that didn't just happen overnight.
Exactly, and since
it's
that's
surreal,
FSU,
but it didn't
which is
happen overnight.
It's one step at a time. Yeah, that's it. That's great advice. So, guys, this was MetaCast, the podcast of the Meta-Analysis Academy. Remember to hit that like button, the subscribe button, and also join our wait list. A lot of what we talked about here is what we're going to discuss in the Medical Research and Career Conference. We're going to do this live conference in Brazil, October 11 and 12. Andy actually speaks Portuguese. He's going to do an invitation for people to watch this episode in Portuguese. He speaks Portuguese really well.
É verdade.
So participate, join. If you speak Portuguese, of course, it's going to be in São Paulo, October 11 and 12. And we're going to talk about immigration to the U.S., about research skills, about research mentorship, networking, research experiences. We're going to have speakers from Brazil, speakers from the U.S. It's going to be great. So if you're interested in this team, if you're interested in having a research career in the U.S., Ph.D., a postdoc fellowship, make sure to join our live Medical Research and Career Conference. So again, Andy, thank you so much for joining. It's been great to have you, and I'll see you guys for the next episode.